The theory of Portuguese discovery of Australia claims that early Portuguese navigators were the first Europeans to sight Australia between 1521 and 1524, well before the arrival of Dutch navigator Willem Janszoon in 1606 on board the Duyfken, who was generally considered to be the discoverer. This is based on the following elements: the Dieppe maps, a group of 16th-century French world maps, which depict a large land mass between Indonesia and Antarctica, labeled as Java la Grande. This land mass carries French, Portuguese, and Gallicized Portuguese place names, and has been interpreted by some as corresponding to Australia's northwestern and eastern coasts. The presence of Portuguese colonies in Southeast Asia from the early 16th century, particularly Portuguese Timor, approximately 650 kilometres from the Australian coast, c. 1513 to 1516. Various antiquities found on Australian coastlines claim to be relics of early Portuguese voyages to Australia. Precedence of discovery has also been claimed for China, France, Spain, India, and even Phoenicia. Historiography. Development of the theory in the 19th century. Although Alexander Dalrymple wrote on this topic in 1786, it was R.H. Major, keeper of maps at the British Museum, who in 1859 first made significant efforts to prove the Portuguese discovered Australia before the Dutch. A group of mid-16th century French maps, the Dieppe maps, formed his main evidence. However, there is widespread agreement today that his approach to historical research was flawed and his claims often exaggerated. Writing in an academic journal in 1861, Major announced the discovery of a map by Manuel Godinho de Heredia, claiming it proved a Portuguese discovery of northwestern Australia, possibly dated to 1601. In fact, as W.A.R. Richardson points out, this map's origins are from 1630. On finally locating and examining Heredia's writings, Major realized the planned voyage to lands south of Sumba in Indonesia had never taken place. Major published a retraction in 1873, but his reputation was destroyed. Major's interpretation was examined critically by the Portuguese historian Joaquim Pedro de Oliveira Martins, who concluded that neither the Patli Regia on the 1521 world map of Antoine de la Salle nor the Java la Grande on the Dieppe maps was evidence of Australia having been discovered by Portuguese visitors in the first quarter of the 16th century, but that this feature had found its way onto the maps from descriptions of islands of the Sunda archipelago beyond Java collected from native informants by the Portuguese. In 1895, George Collingridge produced The Discovery of Australia, an attempt to trace all European efforts to find the Great Southern Land to the time of Cook, and also introducing his interpretation of the theory of Portuguese discovery of Australia using the Dieppe maps. Fluent in Portuguese and Spanish, Collingridge was inspired by the publicity surrounding the arrival in Australia of copies of several Dieppe maps, which had been purchased by libraries in Melbourne, Adelaide and Sydney. Despite a number of errors regarding place names, and untenable theories to explain misplacement on the Dieppe maps, his book was a remarkable effort considering it was written at a time when many maps and documents were inaccessible and document photography was still in its infancy. Collingridge's theory did not find public approval, however, and Professors G. Arnold Wood and Ernest Scott publicly criticized much of what he had written. Collingridge produced a shorter version of this book for use in New South Wales schools, The First Discovery of Australia and New Guinea. It was not used. Professor Edward Heyward also provided early criticism of the theory. In 1899 he noted that the argument for the coasts of Australia having been reached early in the 16th century rested almost entirely on the supposition that at the time, a certain unknown mapmaker drew a large land, with indications of definite knowledge of its coasts, in the quarter of the globe in which Australia is placed. He pointed out that a difficulty arises from the necessity of supposing at least two separate voyages of discovery, one on each coast, though absolutely no record of any such exists. He added, the difficulty, of course, has been to account for this map in any other way. The delineation of Japan in the Dieppe maps, the insertion in them of an Isle des Géants in the southern Indian Ocean, and of Kattigara on the west coast of South America, and in the later versions the depiction of a fictitious coastline of a southern continent with numerous bays and rivers, showed the slight reliance to be placed on them with respect to outlying parts of the world and the influence still exercised on the makers by the old writers. He concluded, this should surely make us hesitate to base so important assumption as that of a discovery of Australia in the 16th century on their unsupported testimony. Kenneth MacIntyre and development of the theory in the 20th century. The development of the theory of Portuguese discovery of Australia owes much to Melbourne lawyer Kenneth MacIntyre's 1977 book, The Secret Discovery of Australia, Portuguese Ventures 200 years before Cook. MacIntyre's book was reprinted in an abridged paperback edition in 1982 and again in 1987, and it was found on school history reading lists by the mid-1980s. According to Dr. Tony Disney, MacIntyre's theory influenced a generation of history teachers in Australian schools. A TV documentary was made of the book in the 1980s by Michael Thornhill and MacIntyre, and the theory featured in many positive newspaper reviews and articles over the next 20 years. Australian history school textbooks also reflect the evolution of acceptance of his theories. The support of Dr. Helen Wallace, curator of maps at the British Library during her visits to Australia in the 1980s, seemed to add academic weight to MacIntyre's theory. In 1987, the Australian Minister for Science, Barry Jones, launching the second Mahogany Ship Symposium in Warrnambool, said, I read Kenneth MacIntyre's important book as soon as it appeared in 1977. I found its central argument persuasive, if not conclusive. The appearance of variant but essentially supporting theories in the late 1970s and early 1980s by other writers, including Ian McKigan and Lawrence Fitzgerald, also added credence to the theory of Portuguese discovery of Australia. In 1994, MacIntyre expressed pleasure that his theory was gaining acceptance in Australia. It is gradually seeping through. The important thing is that it has been on the school syllabus, and therefore students have read about it. They in due course become teachers, and they will then tell their students, and so on. Evidence and arguments. Interpretation of the Dieppe maps. The central plank of the theory of Portuguese discovery of Australia suggests the continent called Java la Grande, which uniquely appears on a series of 16th-century French world maps. The Dieppe school of maps represents Australia. Speaking in 1982, Kenneth MacIntyre described the Dieppe maps as the only evidence of Portuguese discovery of Eastern Australia. He stressed this to point out that the Mahogany Ship and the Jalonquis, and other things of that sort, are not part of the proof that the Portuguese discovered Australia. It is the other way around. The Dieppe maps prove that the Portuguese discovered Australia, and this throws a fierce bright light on our mysteries such as the mahogany ship. Later writers on the same topic take the same approach of concentrating primarily on Java la Grande as it appears in the Dieppe maps, including Fitzgerald, McKigan and most recently, Peter Trickett. Critics of the theory of Portuguese discovery of Australia, including A. Ariel, M. Pearson and W. A. R. Richardson, also concentrate on the Java la Grande land mass of the Dieppe maps. W. A. R. Richardson argues that Java la Grande as it appears on the Dieppe world maps is at least partly based on Portuguese sources that no longer exist. McIntyre attributed discrepancies between the Java la Grande coastline and Australia's to the difficulties of accurately recording positions without a reliable method of determining longitude, and the techniques used to convert maps to different projections. In the late 1970s, mathematician Ian McKigan developed his theory of exponential longitude error theory to explain discrepancies, although he modified this position after a public exchange of opinion with W. A. R. Richardson. McIntyre's own theory about distortion of the maps and the calculations used to correct the maps has also been challenged. Both Lawrence Fitzgerald and Peter Trickett argue Java la Grande is based on Portuguese sea charts, now lost, which the mapmakers of Dieppe misalign. Both these writers try to compare the coastal features of Java la Grande with modern Australia's by realigning them. In 1994, McIntyre suggested that the writings of Pedro Nunes supported his interpretation of the distortion that occurred on the Dieppe maps. Helen Wallace, keeper of maps at the British Museum, referred in 1988 to the interpretation explosion on the subject of the Dieppe maps. She herself argued the case for discovery of Australia by a local Portuguese voyage otherwise unknown 70 years before the Dutch, a chart of which was, presumably, brought back to Dieppe by the survivors of a French voyage to Sumatra led by Jean Parmentier in 1529–30. Cristovão de Mendonça's role. Cristovão de Mendonça is known from a small number of Portuguese sources, notably the famous Portuguese historian João de Barros in Décadas da Ásia, a history of the growth of the Portuguese Empire in India and Asia, published between 1552 to 1615. Mendonça appears in Barras' account with instructions to search from the legendary Isles of Gold. However, Mendonça and other Portuguese sailors are then described as assisting with the construction of a fort at Padilla, and Barros does not mention the expedition again. McIntyre nominated Cristovão de Mendonça as the commander of a voyage to Australia c. 1521–1524, one he argued had to be kept secret because of the 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas, which divided the undiscovered world into two halves for Portugal and Spain. Barros and other Portuguese sources do not mention a discovery of land that could be Australia, but McIntyre conjectured this was because original documents were lost in the 1755 Lisbon earthquake, or the official policy of silence. Most proponents of the theory of Portuguese discovery of Australia have supported McIntyre's hypothesis that it was Mendonça who sailed down the eastern Australian coast and provided charts which found the way onto the Dieppe maps, to be included as Java la Grande in the 1540, 1550s and 1560s. McIntyre claimed the maps indicated Mendonça went as far south as Port Fairy, Victoria. Fitzgerald claims they show he went as far as Tasmania. Trickett states as far as Spencer Gulf in South Australia, and New Zealand's North Island. Claims of Portuguese words in Aboriginal Australian languages in the 1970s and 1980s. German-born linguist Drive Carl Georg von Brandenstein, approaching the theory from another perspective, claimed that 60 words used by Aboriginal people of the Australian Northwest had Portuguese origins. According to University of Adelaide professor Peter Mulhasler, von Brandenstein discusses a number of words in Pilbara languages which show some resemblances with Portuguese words, and concludes that perhaps 15 out of a total of 60 might be borrowings from either Portuguese or Latin. The most convincing is the word for turtle in various Pilbara languages including Naluma, Kariera, Nala, Yinji Bandi, and Yamal, which is Tartaruga or Tartaruga, the former being identical to the Portuguese word for this animal. Such borrowings must presumably date to the early Portuguese interception of the Pilbara coast, and indicate that the Portuguese did communicate with the Aboriginal people of the Pilbara coast. Again, however, there is no evidence that the contacts were intensive or extensive enough to give rise to any contact language. Von Brandenstein also claimed the Portuguese had established a secret colony and cut a road as far as the present-day town of Broome, and that stone housing in the East Kimberley could not have been made without outside influence. However, according to Dr. Nick Thieberger, modern linguistic and archaeological research has not corroborated his arguments. Mulhasler agrees, stating that von Brandenstein's evidence is quite unconvincing. His historical data is speculative, the colonization being clandestine. There are no written records of it, and his claims are not supported by the linguistic evidence he cites. Other purported textual and cartographic evidence. In contemporary Australia, reports of textual and cartographic evidence of varying significance, and occasionally artifacts are sometimes cited as likely to rewrite Australian history because they suggest a foreign presence in Australia. In a recent example of this, in January 2014, a New York gallery listed a 16th-century Portuguese manuscript for sale, one page of which contained marginalia of an unidentified animal that the gallery suggested might be a kangaroo. Dr. Martin Woods of the National Library of Australia commented, "The likeness of the animal to a kangaroo or wallaby is clear enough, but then it could be another animal in Southeast Asia, like any number of deer species. For now, unfortunately, the appearance of a long-eared, big-footed animal in a manuscript doesn't really add much." Dr. Peter Pridmore of La Trobe University has suggested the marginalia depicts an aardvark, speculum orbis terrae. Other texts originating from the same era represent a land to the south of New Guinea, with a variety of flora and fauna. Part of a map in Cornelis de Jode's 1593 Atlas Speculum orbis terrae depicts New Guinea and a hypothetical land to the south inhabited by dragons. Kenneth MacIntyre suggested that although Cornelis de Jode was Dutch, the title page of Speculum orbis terrae may provide evidence of early Portuguese knowledge of Australia. The page depicts 4 animals: a horse, representing Europe; a camel, to represent Asia; a lion, for Africa; and another animal that resembles a kangaroo, to represent a 4th continent. The latter creature features a marsupial pouch containing 2 offspring, and the characteristically bent hind legs of a kangaroo or another member of the macropod family. However, as macropods are found in New Guinea and the Bismarck Archipelago, this may have no relevance to a possible Portuguese discovery of Australia. Another explanation is that the animal is based on a North American opossum. James Cook and Cooktown Harbour. On the 11th of June 1770, James Cook's Endeavour struck a coral reef off the coast of what is now Queensland. It was a potentially catastrophic event and the ship immediately began to take water. However, over the next 4 days the ship managed to limp along, searching for safety. In 1976, MacIntyre suggested that Cook had been able to find a large harbour because he had access to a copy of one of the Dieppe maps. McIntyre felt Cook's comment in his journal, which at the 1982 Mahogany Ship Symposium he cited as "This harbour will do excellently for our purposes, although it's not as large as I had been told," indicated he carried a copy of had seen a copy of the Duyfken map, and by implication was using it to chart his way along the eastern Australian coast. McIntyre acknowledged in his book that Cook may have been told this by the lookout boat crew, but added it was a peculiar remark to make. Quote, reference to this remained in subsequent editions of The Secret Discovery of Australia. In 1997, Ray Parkin edited a definitive account of Cook's voyage of 1768 to 1771, transcribing the Endeavour's original log, Cook's journal and accounts by other members of the crew. Parkin transcribed the relevant journal entry as, anchored in 4 fathom about a mile from the shore, and then made a signal for the boats to come on board, after which I went myself and buoyed the channel, which I found very narrow and the harbour much smaller than I had been told, but very convenient for our purpose. Quote, the log for the 14th of June also mentions the ship's boats sounding the way for the crippled Endeavour. Nevertheless, the influence of McIntyre's interpretation can still be seen in contemporary Australian school curriculum materials. Purported evidence from relics. Mahogany ship. According to McIntyre, the remains of one of Cristovão de Mendonça's caravels was discovered in 1836 by a group of shipwrecked whalers while walking along the sand dunes to the nearest settlement, Port Fairy. The men came across the wreck of a ship made of wood that appeared to be mahogany. Between 1836 and 1880, 40 people recorded that they had seen an ancient or Spanish wreck. Whatever it was, the wreck has not been seen since 1880 despite extensive searches in recent times. McIntyre's accuracy in transcribing original documents to support his argument has been criticized by some recent writers. Dr. Murray John's 2005 survey of 19th-century accounts of the mahogany ship suggests the eyewitness accounts actually relate to more than one shipwreck in the area. Johns concludes these wrecks were of early 19th-century Australian construction and are unrelated to Portuguese maritime activity. The Geelong Keys in 1847 at Lime Burners Point near Geelong, Victoria. Charles Latrobe, a keen amateur geologist, was examining the shells from a lime kiln when a worker showed him a set of 5 keys he claimed to have found. Latrobe concluded that the keys were dropped onto the beach around 100 to 150 years before. Kenneth McIntyre hypothesized they were dropped in 1522 by Mendonça, one of his sailors. Since the keys have been lost, however, their origin cannot be verified. Another more likely theory is that the keys were dropped by one of the diggers shortly before being found. The layer of dirt and shells they were found below was dated as around 2300 to 800 years old, making Latrobe's dating implausible. The error by Latrobe is quite understandable according to geologists Edmund Gill and Peter F. B. Alsop, given that in 1847 most Europeans thought the world was only 6,000 years old. Cannons. 2 bronze cannons were found on a small island in Napier Brome Bay on the coast of Western Australia in 1916. Since these guns were erroneously thought to be carronades, the small island was named Carronade Island. Kenneth McIntyre believed these cannons gave weight to the theory of Portuguese discovery of Australia. However, scientists at the Western Australian Museum in Fremantle have recently made a detailed analysis and have determined that these weapons are swivel guns, and almost certainly of late 18th century Macassar rather than European origin. The claim that one of the guns displays a Portuguese coat of arms is incorrect. In January 2012, a swivel gun found 2 years before at Dundee Beach near Darwin was widely reported by web news sources and the Australian press to be of Portuguese origin. However, initial analysis by the Museum and Art Gallery of the Northern Territory indicated it is probably also of Southeast Asian origin. The museum holds 7 guns of Southeast Asian manufacture in its collections. Another swivel gun of Southeast Asian manufacture, found in Darwin in 1908, is held by the Museum of South Australia. Further analysis in 2014 suggested lead in the Dundee Beach gun most closely resembled lead from Andalusia, a region of Spain. However, sand inside the gun was dated to 1750. Bitangabee Bay. Kenneth McIntyre first suggested in 1977 that the stone ruins at Bitangabee Bay, in Ben Boyd National Park near Eden on the south coast of New South Wales, were of Portuguese origin. The ruins of the foundations of a building, surrounded by stone rubble that McIntyre argued may have once formed a defensive wall. McIntyre also identified the date 15, a 4 carved into a stone. McIntyre hypothesized the crew of a Portuguese caravel may have built a stone blockhouse and defensive wall while wintering on a voyage of discovery down Australia's east coast. Since McIntyre advanced his theory in 1977, significant research on the site has been conducted by Michael Pearson, former historian for the NSW Parks and Wildlife Service. Pearson identified the Bitangabee Bay Ruins as having been built as a storehouse by the Imlay brothers, early European inhabitants, who had whaling and pastoral interests in the Eden area. The local protector of Aborigines, George Augustus Robinson, wrote about the commencement of the building in July 1844. The building was left unfinished at the time of the death of 2 of the 3 brothers, in 1846 and 1847. Other visitors and writers including Lawrence Fitzgerald have been unable to find the 15/4 date. Writing in Beyond Capricorn in 2007, Peter Trickett suggests the date McIntyre saw may be random pig marks in the stonework. Trickett accepts Pearson's work, but hypothesizes the Imleys may have started the building on top of a ruined Portuguese structure, thus explaining the surrounding rocks and partly dressed stones. Trickett also suggests the indigenous Australian name for the area may have Portuguese origins.